Hi, Year 11s. We're back in Chapter 2, Mr. Whitechapel. So this is two conversations primarily. The first is with Whitechapel, so with the slave. You can see that here. And the second, it moves to this conversation with Sanders, who is the junior, so the son of the Sanders Senior, who was in the next chapter, the overseer. And so it begins, and what we notice, and I've written down here, you'll see this tone of superiority, and he's heartless. He seems, and he comes across, especially in the beginning, as uncompromising, callous. So uncompromising, and there's a real callousness, heartlessness in the way that he speaks both to Whitechapel and to Sanders. And so we see in the beginning he addresses all three. But then quickly he tells Whitechapel that the son has brought calamity on his head. He's dead through his own design. He's caused his own death, basically. And here, if you have a look where I'm putting this star here, it says, "Thank God my wife and daughter were not present to witness the debacle." So he seems to be concerned more for his daughter and his wife seeing what happened than what actually happened, the death of the boy. So his wife and daughter's sensibilities and their hurt feelings perhaps are more valuable than the life of a person, the life of a slave. And then further down here, he kind of justifies his actions, justifies the death, that it was just that it happened. He also, towards the bottom here, if you notice, he kind of tries to shift the blame onto Whitechapel. So he's saying, "Whitechapel, you failed. I trusted you." So he's claiming that it was Whitechapel's responsibility to make sure this didn't happen, and the fact that the irony of blaming the slave, that somehow this powerless old slave who's 100 years old somehow is responsible for the tragedy of what happened. I would say that is ironic here. And it notice at the top of 29 that my acquaintances tell me I'm too lenient. So Mr. Whitechapel is lenient compared with others. It makes you really wonder what the other farms and plantations must be like. And the middle here, I say his punishment was just. And right at the bottom here of 29, he orders Whitechapel to give Mr. Sanders an apology. He was saying he's insubordinate. That means disrespectful. And then he sends Whitechapel away. He says, "Close the door behind you." And then he addresses his remarks now to both the overseer and the deputy, and he's quite scathing. So that word scathing. He's quite angry about the way that he addresses both of them, but particularly it's the overseer who is the target of his anger in particular. So the top of page 30, he addresses the deputy briefly, but then shifts to the overseer, Mr. Sanders, who is Sanders Jr., like I said. And here at the top of page 31, you will see that Mr. Whitechapel seems to measure the value of the slaves almost like livestock. There's a comparison by the age and the amount of work that they can get out of him, which is very similar to how people would measure the value of their cows or their cattle, for example. And so Mr. Sanders is fined the value of the boy. And that action of fining the value of the slave seems to indicate that at the time that slaves were seen as livestock, not as people. Later, there is a tone of defense for Whitechapel, so Mr. Whitechapel is speaking about him using some positive terms, is edifying or building up his character and his work ethic. He seems to show here, if you have a look, there is some sympathy. If you look at the bottom here, the lot of the slave is miserable enough without being compounded by unnecessary hardships and cruelties. So I guess it's a bit confusing for us as a reader the first time you might read this through, the contrast between the Mr. Whitechapel we see with the harshness and callousness he speaks to Whitechapel in the beginning. But we see perhaps later in this chapter, but also later in the novel, that he's not a complete monster. But it's hard for us right now, I guess, to understand that whole big picture of who he is. So turn over to page 32. And here on page 32, we certainly see that patronising tone. If you can see there he's describing Africans as our inferiors. And they have lesser faculties, for example, and kind of indicates that they're here suited to slavery because of them being inferior and having lesser faculties. Now, it's really important that you understand that this is not de Agua's views and values. It's the views and values of the time which allowed slavery to be in existence. But as a modern reader, we are invited not to accept these beliefs, but to really see how racist they are. So with our modern eyes, when we read this, we are invited to criticise it and condemn these views and see just how repulsive, how unjust they were. So the purpose of these sorts of comments throughout the book is to reveal the truth of what people believed at the time, but condemn them and see them through the modern eyes that we have. And up here at the top of page 33, Mr. Whitechapel reveals that, or hints at, the act that was perpetrated by your father against his wife, if you can read here. So Whitechapel doesn't hold this act, the rape, against Mr. Sanders. So we're starting to kind of get the idea of something that has happened between Sanders' father, Sanders Sr., and Whitechapel's second wife. And here it becomes a lot more clear at the bottom of page 33. So Whitechapel lost his second wife to your father, You know that she was pure and unsullied until he laid hands on her. Nevertheless, Whitechapel stayed with her after the birth of the boy. Sanders, steady yourself. Your father said you knew all there was to know. He was assured by my father of this fact. So we're inferring as the reader, because of these, that she was raped because before she was pure, and then he laid his hands on her. But we infer also that Sanders Jr. doesn't know. Steady yourself. Your father said you knew, which means he's reacting because he didn't know. And just in case we were unclear, it's very clear here that this would have prevented you whipping your own half-brother to death. And Whitechapel should have reminded you. He must have thought that you knew and didn't care. So that's there. And Mr. Whitechapel keeps talking about the fact that you were supposed to know, you should have known, everybody else has died that knew this or that has disappeared except for Whitechapel. So Sanders Sr. had died. This boy was no ordinary runaway. He was your half-brother. The top of page 36, we've got 35, sorry, we've got another reference to the name of the book, The Longest Memory. Whitechapel's longevity and living memory ensures that. Okay, our consciences, for God's sake, ensure it too. And here, right at the very end, there's this appeal to Christianity, that God should guide us in our dealings with slaves as he counsels us in everything else. And they pray together. So join me in a little prayer. So Sanders Jr. And Mr. Whitechapel pray together, and they ask for advice and strength. But the modern reader, again, us as readers, we recognise how hypocritical this faith seems alongside this obvious inequality and the brutality of slavery. And we're invited to condemn how the name of God and Christianity is used to support slavery. So that's the end of that chapter. Hopefully you've been able to make some notes that you can use in your essays and put into your table. Thank you all.